You ever heard of David Ruggles? He's very important in New York history. This is a short article called David Ruggles, Committee of Vigilance, Fighting Against Slavery in New York, a city loath to acknowledge its horrors. On September 4th, 1838, Frederick Bailey, a 20-year-old fugitive slave, stepped off. I don't like the word fugitive slave. I prefer the term self-emancipated. But let's read the article. A 20-year-old fugitive slave stepped off a ferry boat onto Manhattan Island and began his first full day as a free man. New York City was a temporary way station, a place where he could disappear into the crowd. He was filled with joy at the urban spectacle. I was walking amid the hurrying throng, he later recalled, and gazing upon dazzling wonders of Broadway. The dreams of my childhood and the purpose of my manhood were now fulfilled. Joy quickly turned to fear. By sheer luck, Bailey ran into someone he knew, another escapee, working as a whitewasher under a new name, William Dixon. Dixon warned Bailey that the city was now full of Southerners returning home from their annual summer vacations in the North, and that there were hired men on the lookout for fugitives from slavery, including some black New Yorkers who for a few dollars would betray me into the hands of the slave catchers, that I must trust no man with my secret. Bailey realized that he was easy prey to the kidnappers, if any should happen to be on my track. After spending a lonely night on a deserted wharf, Bailey made his way to the bookstore and home of David Ruggles, secretary of the New York Committee of Vigilance, an organization founded in 1835 to confront slavery and racism head on. Born of free black parents in Connecticut in 1810, Ruggles had been a sailor, a grocer, and a printer before turning his home into a shop selling anti-slavery books and a meeting ground for the city's black and white abolitionists. By 1837, Ruggles and his comrades had already helped more than 335 African Americans escaping slavery. Years later, after Frederick Bailey, who changed his name to Frederick Douglass and became the nation's most prominent African-American activist, he remembered his New York host with appreciation. Mr. Ruggles was the first officer on the Underground Railroad with whom I met after reaching the North. He was a whole-souled man, fully imbued with a love of his afflicted and hunted people. By the time Bailey arrived on Ruggles' doorstep, that's Frederick Douglass, the bookstore owner and a small band of other New Yorkers had been fighting slavery and racial discrimination for nearly a decade. Although New York State's remaining slave had been freed in 1827, many white New Yorkers treated their free black neighbors with suspicion or open hostility. White artisans kept African American workers out of many city jobs and labor unions, while a growing population of Irish immigrants competed with black men and women for positions as servants, laundresses, seamstresses, waiters, barbers, and street vendors. Sound familiar? Black children were limited to a small number of segregated schools. White business owners excluded colored people from equal treatment on the city's streetcar and steamboat lines. Now remember, wasn't no bridges. Everything was steamboat. So to get from Brooklyn to Manhattan, you had to take a boat. Everything was a ferry. Yeah, think of Staten Island. Everything's a ferry, except there ain't no bridge to the Staten Island. Okay, everything is a ferry. Colored people from equal treatment on the city streetcar and steamboat lines. Most boarding houses and hotels and many restaurants. The New York Zoological Institute refused to admit black New Yorkers as customers, nor did freedom bring political rights. New York State's 1821 Constitution required black men to own at least $250 in property in order to vote, and very few black New Yorkers had enough money to qualify. Black women, like white women, were barred from voting equally, which is why white women started the feminist movement, the suffrage/feminist movement, because they were pissed off about the fact that black men were going to get the right to vote before them. That's a quote. On top of all this, thousands of white New Yorkers were ardent defenders of Southern slavery. On top of all this, thousands of white New Yorkers were ardent defenders of Southern slavery. The city's economy rested heavily on the trade with the South. New York merchants and bankers shipped slave-grown cotton to England, extended loans to Southern planters so they could plant their crops and buy new slaves, and insured their property, including said slaves. New York retailers, wholesale dealers, and working people profited when Southern merchants and planters arrived in town to buy textile made from cotton and stay in Broadway hotels. Often those Southerners brought with them their enslaved servants, which New York state law allowed for them to do so for up to 9 months at a time. Most New York City voters, moreover, were members of a Democratic Party. Of which party? The Democratic Party, which actively supported slavery. The Democratic Party, which actively supported slavery. When anti-slavery activists tried to hold an interracial meeting in the Chatham Street Chapel in July in 1834, white mobs started 3 days of riots, driving some 500 African Americans out of their homes. In sum, New York often seemed to be as much as a southern city as a northern one. A place whose economy and politics were bound up with slavery. No wonder that in 1839, the Colored American, the city's black newspaper, blasted what it called the deep and damning thraldom which grinds to the dust the colored inhabitants of New York. 16 years later, the black abolitionist William Wells Brown, have you ever heard of these people? We need to be knowing who these people are. We need to put these people's faces on shirts. You know what I'm saying? William Wells Brown repeated the charge when he denounced the pro-slavery Negro-hating city of New York. Facing such bleak circumstances, Ruggles and his colleagues dedicated themselves to bringing change through direct action. By the early 1830s, Ruggles was a key member in a circle of activists based in the city's black church congregations and in black self-help organizations like the New York African Society for Mutual Relief. He identified strongly with William Lloyd Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society, which called for the interracial action to end American slavery immediately. But while Garrison advocated, of course, for nonviolence, Ruggles felt differently. And this is in the 1830s, y'all, when they try to tell you, oh, we not like our grandparents. These are some of our grandparents. Some of y'all grandparents is different. Anyway. But while Garrison advocated for nonviolence, Ruggles felt differently. He called for practical abolition, meaning that black and white abolitionists must confront slave owners and their allies forcefully, even in the streets of New York City. Whenever necessity requires, let that remedy be applied, he wrote. Whatever necessity requires, let that remedy be applied, he wrote in 1836. Come what may. Anything is better than slavery. Come what? Let's read that all together. Whatever necessity requires, let that remedy be applied. Come what may, anything is better than slavery. Ruggles' solution was the Committee of Vigilance, a group of black and white New York anti-slavery activists he helped create in Manhattan in 1835. The committee's goal was to protect unoffending, defenseless, and endangered persons of color by securing their rights as far as practicable. Ruggles was the committee secretary and lead actor, and New York, as the nation's major seaport, gave him plenty of opportunities to put his theory into practice, child. In December 1836, for example, the Portuguese slave ship, the Brilliante, arrived in the harbor with 5 enslaved Africans on board. So at this point, the importation of people from other countries is illegal. But what was rampant was breeding and kidnapping. So, but we can see that even though it was illegal, just as today, things that are illegal are still finding its way into our city. So just as then, now New York City was complicit and okay and allowing under the table for a few slaves to still come into its ports. Portuguese slave ship Brilliante arrived in the harbor with 5 enslaved Africans on board. Several men connected to Ruggles sprang into action. On Christmas Eve, they stormed the Brilliante and escaped with 2 enslaved men. When a sailor tried to stop them, one of the gang cocked a pistol at him and threatened to blow his brains out. These are these grandparents that y'all keep disrespecting by saying that they were docile. The committee also used direct confrontation to fight the Southern slaves whose masters brought them to New York, but openly ignored the 9-month limit. Enslaved servants, both men and women, fought to use the law to escape or argue for their own freedom. Ruggles and his allies confronted slave owners face to face to try to force emancipations. The meetings sometimes became shouting or shoving matches. In one case, in 1838, an enraged Virginian, John P. Darg, had Ruggles thrown into jail after he tried to negotiate freedom for Thomas Hughes, a slave of Darg who had run away in New York with several $1,000s of his master's money. Okay, he took the money and ran, all right? Despite the setback, the abolitionists eventually won Hughes' freedom after the master tried to sell him into the Deep South, okay? But most of the committee was their crusade against the kidnappers who posed a threat to every black resident of New York City. Paid agents and bounty hunters roamed the city seeking to capture runaways. They were aided by city officials. They were aided by New York City officials who allowed black men and women and children to be jailed and shipped to the South without few questions asked, even though state law supposedly required that they be granted trial by jury. The city's kidnapping clubs, as Ruggles called them, went even further. The city officials pounced on legally free black New Yorkers and dragged them to the South for sale on the flimsy assertion that they were runaways. Children as young as 9 years old, John Welch, lured from his Mulberry Street home, were caught up in his dragnet and were sometimes shipped hundreds of miles away before their parents could plead for their return. With funds provided by local white abolitionists and by a network of 100 black New Yorkers who raised cash from hundreds more black New Yorkers, the Committee of Vigilance hired skilled lawyers to help captives held in city jails or already deported to the South. Although the city's judges, many of them well-connected Democrats, see, ain't much changed in New York City. Although the city's judges, many of them well-connected Democrats, sometimes refused to cooperate. By 1838, Ruggles and his committee had saved a reported 522 individuals from slavery. The committee counted on the influence and support of its white members, but black men and women were its troops on the ground, keeping an eye out on potential kidnappers and mobilizing the city's African-American community to assist Ruggles. Ruggles also put together a network of safe houses and churches across the Northeast that became stops on the Underground Railroad to freedom. By the 1840s, New York City's Committee of Vigilance had inspired the creation of similar groups in Philly, Albany, Boston, Rochester, Cleveland, Detroit, and elsewhere, all bent on helping African Americans to flee and resist slavery. The Committee of Vigilance was largely forgotten, as historians later decades focused on the efforts of white abolitionists and singled out just a few black anti-slavery activists such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman for attention. And we love them both, but we got to give credit to David Ruggles, okay? For most black New Yorkers and their white allies who struggled in later generations against racism, segregation, and discrimination in New York, as we doing still today, even with a black mayor, New York City as well as the South, the name David Ruggles meant nothing. Yet in their efforts, these later activists unknowingly echoed the defiance of the leader of the New York City's Committee of Vigilance. Whatever necessity requires, let that remedy be applied. Come what may, anything is better than slavery. I just wanted to bring to everyone's attention this amazing foundational black American in history, in New York history. I think it's a shame that I've never heard of him before. So I guess it really doesn't matter if you're in Florida or not. You know, you have to go and seek out your own history. I'd never heard of this man before, and when I read this article, I had to share it because I felt that this is something that we need to know. One, we need to know what the climate was. What was the foundational black Americans thinking and saying in the 1800s? When they sit there and they tell us that New York was a free state, that New York was blue, and New York was anti-slavery, that's a lie. They participated, they profited, and they were the most, let me tell you this is a quote from the book, The Kidnapping Club by Jonathan Wells. New York was the most pro-slavery, pro-South city north of the Mason-Dixon line. The money, what built New York, was our blood and sweat from the South, being funneled from the South into this city to make it run. I just want you to see all of these things so you can know about real New York history.